There's a secret trick in Pokemon Go where you can transform a shiny Pokemon into a completely different shiny Pokemon, and I've demonstrated this trick multiple times on my channel, but I've never fully explained exactly how it works. And this trick can be used to get some insanely rare Pokemon and even possibly a Shundo. So I'm going to show you how this trick works and which events you can apply it to. So with that being said, let's start with Spotlight Hour. Spotlight Hour is an event that happens every Tuesday from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. your local time, and during that time, a specific Pokemon will be spawning in mass. And the trick for this Spotlight event is to find a shiny Pokemon about 5 to 10 minutes before the Spotlight Hour begins. But instead of catching this shiny Pokemon, you disengage with the shiny and you wait until Spotlight Hour begins. And once 6 p.m. rolls around, that shiny Pokemon will transform into the Spotlight Hour Pokemon, and as long as that Spotlight Hour Pokemon's shiny form has been released, the newly transformed Spotlight Pokemon will still be shiny. One thing to note though is that this Pokemon needs to be a purely wild spawn. If it's come off of a lure or an incense, it will not change into the Spotlight Hour Pokemon, and more than likely, you're probably gonna lose that shiny. I've done this trick for Spotlight Hour multiple times, and it's worked every single time, but there are a few risks. And the biggest risk you run during this time is that the shiny Pokemon could possibly despawn before the Spotlight Hour even begins. Usually a Pokemon has a spawn timer about 30 minutes to an hour on them, so there's a chance while you're waiting for Spotlight Hour to begin, the shiny Pokemon could despawn on you. Hence why I say if there's about a 5 to 10 minute wait before the Spotlight Hour, you've got a decent chance of it still being there, but there's always a chance it could despawn literally like a minute before the event starts. So only use this trick on a shiny Pokemon that you're okay with possibly losing forever. And another potential issue that you could run into is the shiny rate of a Pokemon. Most Pokemon in Pokemon Go have a shiny rate of about 1 in 450 to 1 in 500, and we usually call those full odd shiny Pokemon. But there are a few shiny Pokemon that are perma-boosted shinies, which means they have about a 1 in 50 to 1 in 75 odd rate of being shiny. But like I said, most Pokemon found in the wild are full odd shinies, but if you want to know what the perma-boosted shinies are, I've left a link in the description box below to the Silph Road. They have a very accurate page on shiny rates for most Pokemon in Pokemon Go. But if you want this trick to work, the shiny rates of the Pokemon have to be exactly the same. So for example, if I find a shiny Pikachu just before Snorlax Spotlight Hour, since I know that those are both full odd shiny Pokemon, once Snorlax Hour rolls around and the Pikachu hasn't despawned, it will turn into a shiny Snorlax. But if I find a perma-boosted shiny like a Scyther and I want it to turn into a shiny Snorlax, though it isn't a completely 0% chance of happening, it's an extremely low chance that that Scyther will become a shiny Snorlax. And also vice versa, if I find a shiny Snorlax in the wild and I for some reason want to turn it into a shiny Scyther, it would probably not work, but again, there's a very low chance that it could. And in case you were wondering if this trick works by the end of Spotlight Hour, say you find a Spotlight Hour shiny but you really don't want it, but say there's an event going on with a costume shiny that you really want, this trick will work with that, but again, there are a few risks that you take with this one. The first one being that this shiny could turn into a Pokemon that doesn't even have a shiny form out, so you basically just lose a shiny. And even if you catch that Pokemon that isn't shiny and its shiny comes out later, it's not going to turn into a shiny form of that Pokemon. And another risk you run with this is that during Spotlight Hours, certain spawn points get activated that aren't normally activated during normal gameplay. So if you find a shiny on one of these newly activated spawn points and Spotlight Hour ends, that spawn's just going to completely disappear and won't turn into anything at all, and you could potentially lose that shiny. But again, like I said earlier, only do this trick on shinies that you're okay with losing and that you don't need. Now I'm sure you're curious if this trick can be used on Community Day, and the answer is both yes and no. As I mentioned before, the shiny rates of the Pokemon are very important for this trick to work, and during Community Day, the shiny rates change to about a 1 in 25 shiny odd. So if you find a full odd shiny Pokemon and you want to turn it into the Community Day shiny, there is a chance of it happening because it is a 1 in 25 rate, but again, it's not guaranteed. And you're gonna find a lot of those Community Day shinies anyway, so there's really no point in risking it. But there is something else you can do. Even though the shiny rates change and it completely ruins that side of the trick, another part of the trick stays, and that's the IVs. Whenever the Pokemon transforms, usually the IVs will stay exactly the same, so if you're grinding just before Community Day and your friend catches a 100% Pidgey, you could just hold off and not catch that Pidgey and hope it doesn't despawn until Community Day starts, and whenever you catch that Community Day Pokemon it turns into, it will be a hundo. But just like everything else, there is a risk to that, and that is the weather system in the game. Let's say that 100% Pidgey is windy weather boosted, but when it transforms into the Community Day Pokemon, it will no longer be weather boosted because it's not boosted by windy weather. Sadly, that would make the new Pokemon's IVs re-roll into something completely different. But if the weather stays exactly the same and the Community Day Pokemon is boosted by windy weather, the IVs will stay the exact same. And this also applies if the weather boost doesn't affect either one of the Pokemon. So let's say it's snowy weather, so the Pidgey isn't boosted, but it's still a hundo, and it turns into a sunny boosted Pokemon, then it will stay a 100%. And the last scenario I'm gonna throw at you is, what if the Pidgey is windy weather boosted, making it a 100%, but then when Community Day starts, it's a sunny boosted Community Day Pokemon, but the weather changes to sunny. Unfortunately, in that instance, even though the Pokemon is still technically boosted, the IVs do re-roll because it's not the exact same weather boost. So it's a little finicky, but there are plenty of opportunities where you could take advantage of this IV trick as well. And the best thing about this trick during Community Day is that you have a 100% that's turning into a Community Day Pokemon, which has a 1 in 25 odd rate of being shiny, so you have a 1 in 25 rate of possibly getting a Shundo, as long as the in-game weather cooperates with you. Now let's mention the normal in-game events that we get a couple times each month. This trick can be applied to those events as well, because these events go live usually at 10 a.m. your local time, which means that you could find a shiny Pokemon around 9:50 and just hold off catching it, and potentially it could turn into the brand new shiny of the event, so you could get it right off the rip. But you do run the risk of the Pokemon transforming into a shiny that you potentially already have, or even a Pokemon in the event rotation that doesn't have its shiny released yet, and you could potentially lose a shiny and get a non-shiny. I personally haven't been lucky enough to find a shiny before a brand new event goes live like that, so I haven't been able to test it, but I know it is possible. As long as the shiny rates are the same, you could get the brand new shiny that gets released for the event. And lastly, we're gonna go over live events, and that includes things like Safari Zones, Go Fests, anything that you would physically travel to. And the reason why I'm adding live events to this video is because they've recently added a feature to these live events that make this trick just absolutely busted. For the first 2 minutes of every hour of the Safari Zones and Go Fest, they've introduced a new Spotlight Hour effect, where usually it's the brand new featured shiny for either the Safari Zone or for the Go Fest. They had a whole bunch of unknowns everywhere. And the reason why it's so successful is because everything during these events usually has a perma-boosted shiny rate on them. And I have plenty of examples to show how this works. For starters, I went to the Goyang Safari Zone and I found a shiny Feebas, but I had a couple minutes left before a whole bunch of Spritzies were gonna show up everywhere. And I would much rather have gotten a shiny Spritzy over a shiny Feebas, so I waited a little bit and then they switched over, and sure enough, I got myself a shiny Spritzy. During the Go Fest events, I turned a whole bunch of basic shiny Pokemon that I already had into shiny unknowns that I really needed for my collection. And in one instance, I turned a shiny Charmander into a shiny cowboy hat Snorlax, which was a huge surprise. So if you end up going to any of these live events where they have the first 2 minutes as a spotlight hour for that specific shiny Pokemon that they've introduced to the game, definitely try to take advantage of it if you haven't been able to grab a few of those shinies already. But just like all the other events that I mentioned in this video, the same risks apply. For one, the Pokemon can despawn on you before it changes over. The Pokemon could also turn into a potential non-shiny Pokemon. They do have those during the live events. And during those events, sometimes it's really hard to tell what's a lore spawn and what's a wild spawn. So you could wait a little bit of a time and then all of a sudden it just doesn't change over. That happened with me. Specifically, I was trying to turn a Scyther into a shiny Finneon, and then it turns out it was a lore spawn. Wasn't a huge fan of that moment, to be honest. I hope you found this video helpful, and if you did, smash that subscribe button. We're trying to hit our goal of 100,000 subscribers, and we are getting so close to that milestone, so if you haven't already subscribed and you found the content very helpful, please do. And also let me know in the comments down below, have you used this trick before? Did you even know this trick existed? I would love to know. And if you're really enjoying the content and you want to see even more of it, I highly suggest you check out this video right over here. But with that being said, I hope to see you in the next one.